we should get started. I think I thought there was someone in the way in, but they're not. So welcome to our next in our series of inaugural lectures for this year. These are wonderful occasions when we celebrate the promotion of one of our own to a professor, and we have a series of 6 during this current year, 3 women and 3 men, and today we have Professor Tim Weyrich, and it's a great time to celebrate their achievement and to hear in a slightly more public view some of the work that they've done and some of the impact that they've made with that work. But before I ask Tim to deliver his lecture, I wanted to give just a little bit of background to let you know how he arrived at UCL. So he started with an undergraduate degree from the Technical University of Karlsruhe, before going on to do a PhD at ETH Zurich. From there, he won a very prestigious fellowship to Princeton, a 3-year fellowship which included the title of lecturer and included the permission to lecture, which is not readily given at Princeton. However, he cut that short to come to UCL, so I think he made a very wise decision at that point, and took up a lectureship here, and has progressed through from a lecturer to senior lecturer to reader, and in October of last year to professor. He has been extremely productive in all aspects of his work here, obviously in the research side, but also in his willingness to get involved in all sorts of other activities in organization and administration. To mention one, he's co-founder and deputy director of the Center of Digital Humanities, which has been an important development, and I'm sure you will see some evidence of his work in that area in the talk. But I think it's something that we really value as a whole new initiative from the point of view of the department and the college. So I think, without further ado, I will hand over now to Tim and ask him to deliver the lecture and hear from him the work that he's been involved in. Jim.
Thank you very much. Right. Today I'm going to talk about, well, all the things, well, not quite all the things that I've done, but let's say I was trying to find, a common theme of what is it I've been actually doing. And I found it actually remarkably hard. And it took me a while until I realized why that is. And I like to think it's because I really enjoy applying visual computing in all kinds of cross-disciplinary domains and in the applied context. And as such, I have to go out, find other application domains, and so on. And that makes it. And if somebody asks me, "What are you doing?" I think of, okay, I've done that, and that, and it's difficult to see what's actually running through. But it was a healthy exercise having to prepare for this inaugural lecture, because I actually believe there is a message running through. And so, I already went through that exercise, so I emerged the wiser, and I hope you're also going to have a good take-home message from it. Right, so I'm a professor in visual computing. Now, I made the effort of looking up what visual computing actually is at Wikipedia, the ultimate authority in the question. Wikipedia also confirmed that it's basically, visual computing is sorry, that's actually the second bullet. So visual computing, in my sense, is basically anything that deals with a visual appearance of reality. And as such, because we're in computing, it really bridges the reality and the visual domain through basically the visual interface. And Wikipedia said it very clearly that the core challenges are acquisition, processing, analysis, and rendering of visual information. I was happy with that because I recognized myself in it. So far, so good. And I have to say, I find all of these challenges in my own work if I work on appearance modeling, in applied contexts. Now, appearance is maybe a bit of an abstract term. Everyone has, as only so often with normal English words, everyone has slightly different connotations with it. Now, mathematically speaking, or let's say from the perspective from a computer scientist, appearance of objects is basically anything that impacts the way how light interacts with a scene. So if you have a human observer and you're looking at a scene, then what you see is the light coming back from a scene. So it tells you two things. Without a light source, there can be no visual appearance. And without a human observer, the whole concept of appearance is moot. So much of what I've done is about, finding representations and descriptions for real-world appearance and acquiring them from real-world objects. Now, appearance comes in many flavors. So what makes up appearance? For instance, the shape of an object has a clear impact on its appearance. Surface structure, technical term is mesogeometry. If you have, something that looks, let's say, from a distance flat, but if you get close, you see it's got, a fine texture, for instance, then that's mesogeometry. And then there is something that we often call material, or another term for that is basically reflectance. It really determines how does a given surface point interact with light. And common terms for that are color, level of gloss, anisotropy of the highlights, whether the material is scattering, whether it's translucent, and so on. Now the interesting thing is that if you look at the physical reality of appearance, then all these three different notions, which seem some orthogonal concepts, they actually all map pretty much to geometry, but on different scales. So shape clearly is a macroscopic aspect of geometry, but in fact, most of these material reflectance aspects on a microscopic level, they're simply a matter of shape of the microgeometry and, let's say, the index of refraction of the material. But in computer graphics, we tend to separate these things just to keep things tractable. And another interesting thing is why it's so valuable to actually look into these different aspects of appearances. They all directly relate to the physical properties of an object. So if you acquire a good model of the appearance of an object, you're already one step closer to having learned something about the physicality of the object. So specifically, if you're interested in capturing appearance representations from real-world objects, because we're in visual computing, and visual computing also deals with extracting things from camera images, then it's difficult to make a decision where to start, because the entirety of aspects of appearance is simply vast. And before you start digitizing anything or capturing appearance, you have to make a decision of which effects to capture. You also have to make a decision, because we're engineers, we know if you measure something, you have to know what your error bars are. What is the accuracy and precision that you're aiming for? Aspects like cost, speed, ease of use, effect of acquisition, all of those things come in. And that is really where a field, you cannot do, well, there's very little you can do in this field in terms of, useful research if you're not looking with one eye on the application domain. So I really believe any form of appearance digitization should be informed by the application domain. And the other thing is, it's almost impossible to come up to build a construction for appearance capture and not think about how are you going to represent this in the computer afterwards. So any system for appearance capture needs to be co-designed with your representation. Right, how do you pick a representation? Well, your ideal representation should be accurate enough. It should also convey the right degree of realism. Now, an interesting question is of whether those are two identical goals, right? Maybe if you get something very accurate, it's becoming automatically very realistic. But because appearance is something that involves a human observer, where there's also some psychological effects in perception, this isn't always the same thing. And if you're talking about accuracy, then you also have to ask the accuracy of what quantity. And some quantities play a bigger role in terms of realism than others. So this is really by no means a hard science, and needs a lot of, also gut feeling and applying it on the applied domain. And when I'm talking about applied domains, even within computer graphics and visual computing itself, we actually have, you know, a lot of things going on that all work on the so-called content creation pipeline. So people that create, you know, nice 3D models for computer games, for films, and so on, they care about where do our models, our representations of appearance come from? How can we edit them? How can we render them? So at the very least, your representation should, you know, have an eye on this content creation pipeline. So let's look at some examples of how one can basically design an acquisition principle, acquisition hardware, and respective representations around application domains. And we'll start with attempts to getting materials look really lifelike. And there's not many materials that are as interesting to work on as human skin. Because human skin is delicate for multiple reasons. First of all, there's a lot of things going on within the material. So you have multiple interfaces in skin, which is a layered material. You have many forms of scattering and refraction and reflecting effects there. Light is bouncing around within the skin, assumes some of the physical properties inside, and then carries information about this interior skin to the outside again. And most importantly, we're all experts in how skin should look like, because we spend a lot of time of our lives just looking at skin. So I think that makes it interesting as a benchmark for lifelike appearance reconstruction. So let's see what we can do with, let's say, the simplest possible representation. Well, maybe not the simplest possible, but it's still comparatively crude, if you will. So you can describe skin reflectance as a combination of surface reflectance. So basically model skin as, you know, something that's locally planar, and you've got material on one side, you've got air on the other side, and you've got light bouncing off the surface. And you model that as purely specular reflectance. You then can say we've got the second term, which is scattering within the material. Light is entering at one point, scattering around, exiting elsewhere. And we assume that the material is entirely homogeneous and it's optically dense, for those of you who know what that means. And in order to allow for a little bit of interesting color variations and texture, we should insert a modulating color texture. So that's a fairly ad hoc model, but very close to what people actually have been using in computer games and feature films for a long time. And if you represent, let's say, a human face using this, you know, diffuse scattering term and surface reflectance, and you add these terms together, you get something that looks reasonably like human face. Well, we show that given the right hardware effort, in this case, that's actually the outcome of my PhD, this is how far this goes back. If you're willing to build a device out of 150 light sources, 16 cameras, 2 3D scanners, and spend a lot of time processing data, you can actually recreate facial appearance quite accurately. On the left-hand side, you see a photograph of a person inside this measurement setup. So this is a camera image under a controlled lighting condition. And on the right-hand side, you see overlaid. You can actually see a very faint scene here. So we're only reconstructing the facial surface. The rendering of the face that restages the viewing and lighting conditions. And in this side-by-side comparison, you can see we're getting very close. So in a sense, if you say the task is to replicate an input photograph using a slightly more advanced reflectance model, and that could be considered a success. Now, why would you want to do that? Just reproducing a photograph doesn't make much sense. But the nice thing is the moment you have a model of appearance, you can actually change your viewing directions. Look, you know, assume viewpoints that you haven't observed with the camera. You can even change the lighting. You can play around with the lighting, and you'll again end up with something that looks plausible. So that's why we're doing this. So that's good. So we solved the problem of acquiring reflectance of a real-world object, and it looks fairly real. The problem, though, is there's many things that it doesn't deliver yet. So, for instance, creating such a model manually is very difficult. Well, it doesn't have that many parameters. You could, paint textures by hand, tweak some parameters by hand, but the chances that the result is going to look realistic are very low. So So the real challenge is, how can you edit things in a way so that it automatically looks real? And that I would call, high-level editing. So if you want to go there, it actually pays off to get closer to the physical reality. So here's actually a picture of a publication of format sitting here. I'm glad you came. That actually shows, quite nicely the layered structure of skin. Skin has, depending on how you count, between 5 and 7 layers, but for a very crude and simple separation would be to say there is some surface reflectance at the top, then there is a layer which is the epidermis, and then there's the dermis. We can replicate this with a very schematic model, and then we can say that we allow for spatially varying differences in scattering and absorption behaviors, and to make it closer to reality, we actually say we express these spatially varying absorption criteria through concentrations of chromophores. Now, chromophores are the chemicals in skin that absorb light and that give skin the color that it has. So, for instance, beta-carotene makes your skin slightly orange. If you eat carrots all day, that's what actually happens. Melanin is actually what makes us tan and what determines different skin types. So by basically coming up with a model that's only slightly more complex than we had before, but giving it meaningful physical parameters and using absorption spectra, for instance, from medical literature, we can actually edit and author quite realistic skin much more easily. So what you see on the left-hand side is a geometry that I think Abhijit was involved in that capture. Where are you? Thank you. Right there. What you're looking at is basically a normal map. It's basically the essence of the geometry of a human hand, of the palm. You can actually see how it's held like that, right? So we used that geometry, but we wanted to make it look like skin. So we asked a student who was sitting in the lab and who had 3 cycles. We were very close to the SIGGRAPH deadline. He should please paint something that looks a little bit like hemoglobin distributions, or looks like melanin distributions. The student had no idea what it is, so we gave it to him in a nutshell, and then he sat down in Photoshop while staring at his hand and just made something up. But what he drew was not a colorful image. He just drew black and white concentration maps that looked really like your average Photoshop texture generation brush. But the trick is we plugged it into this model, which used these fantasy maps to modulate physiologically accurate chemicals, and what you get is something that looks already skin colored. So here's another thing where that is really handy and useful for various applications in content creation. You can now go and start editing these and altering these maps. So for instance, what the student did is, this down here is the hemoglobin map that he drew, so it already tells you how epoch it was. Now he drew a different hemoglobin map, and it was trying to simulate how it looks if you clench your fist and open it again. And if you try that yourself, you will see that you have blotchy patterns on your palm. And it looks like the project reset itself after I just recalibrated it, but never mind. If you squint, you might actually be able to see the effect. But the good thing is, if you operate that way, it's actually very difficult to achieve something that doesn't look like skin. Yeah. So that's the good news. That's why it really pays off to go through that geopaint. So the projector is really. Am I going to fix it now? No, I'll leave it about. Sorry, I'll put it up. Okay. We need. If we had more contrast, you would actually see a tattoo. Okay. So I'll skip that and we'll move on. Just trust me, you can do all kinds of realistic tricks. It's always going to look like skin. So we now manage to have ease of manual creation. We allow for high-level editing. However, there's other things that we don't really manage yet. And so, for instance, how do you realistically animate these things? And here's why you would like to animate skin appearance. Skin appearance can change over various different timescales, right? So there's, for instance, aging definitely changes your skin appearance. There are situations in which, everyone who's seen Benjamin Button knows, there is applications in special effects for changing skin appearance over time, even if it's slow time. There's other changes such as tanning that can happen, within 24 hours, and those changes that can be very rapid. we've had this example about blood perfusion changes. And that could be due to mechanical changes. It could be histamine reactions. It could be rashes, allergic reactions, and so on. It could be blushing, which is also very immediate. It could be due to alcohol consumption. So here, this seminal paper by Tsumura et al., where they simulated a face after wine drinking and compared it to a real tipsy person. Now, why is that useful, right? There's a lot of information conveyed and in skin appearance. And here's a very nice work by Sylvia Pan. Is Sylvia here? But the supervisor's here, Mel. This was an interesting work that actually figured that people in virtual environment settings, where they're basically guided through an application by a virtual avatar, where they're absolutely certain that that's not a human being. It's clearly an avatar. It's even slightly stylized and so on. But people would behave differently in that virtual environment, depending on whether the avatar blushes or not. Which isn't logical, but it shows that there's going to be a subconscious program running when we look at faces and face color. So how can we basically achieve realistic changes in facial appearance? So what we did is we had Tim was meaning to come. I don't see him. So this is Tim Scully, a student who did a lot of skin work. And Tim and I built, a contraption out of cardboard and some polarizer films and the camera and 2 flashes. And with that setup, which was spectrally calibrated, we were able to basically look inside skin and determine hemoglobin concentration. So here's an example. If you, it's really, okay, imagine that this looks much more dramatic if the projector was calibrated. It's got a white boost in here. That's why everything is desaturated. So you see me going through 2 facial expressions, and if you look closely, you can actually see that there's some reddening taking place at my cheeks. In fact, if you look at the image coming from the camera, you can see very clearly how the hemoglobin concentration goes up. So what we did is we captured, lots of different facial expressions. We sent my student Tim. We sent him, running up a couple of flights of stairs, down again, up again, and then taking pictures in rapid succession, filming how his face got redder and redder. Ran temporal analysis of that. We had Tim drinking, very small quantities of a pint over 1 hour, and it was really interesting. Over that 1 hour, we could really get a very nice curve of increase in. I made sure, I wasn't sure about the ethics approval procedures about that one. So I made absolutely sure not to tell Tim that he should do this. I may have said something, I wish somebody would do it, but it's it was definitely on his own account, and he did that. So, and what we did with that, what we learned from that is basically a model to drive dynamic appearance of skin. We coupled this model to a so-called blend shape model, which is a standard way how artists model animations in feature films. And here you see a classical blend shape animation. We have a fairly realistic skin rendering and fairly realistic skin parameters here. And blend shape animation now deforms the underlying geometry in order to create a certain facial expression. So that was the state of the art, right? You deform a face, and that is what we call, the facial expression disgust. But something's lacking. Color variation is lacking. Now, if you add the color variations that we captured using our device, it looks like that. Before, after. It may be a subtle change, but it makes once you've seen it, and you go back to the original thing, then you see, all right, now it's bloody obvious that somebody just moved a couple of vertices around. The face isn't quite right. So here's another close-up how the reddening of the cheeks takes place, and so on. And it looks plausible. So you can actually simulate that in real time. So this is actually a real-time capture. It was already a couple of years ago on a graphics card that renders this with 60 frames a second, including subsurface scattering and so on. Right, and you see very slight color variations that come with the different facial expressions. Good. So that was an example how you can basically. Sorry. Let's just see. Is that this far? Yeah. Okay. This was an example from the domain of recreating one material as lifelike as possible and trying to address the content creation needs. Another need that comes up quite frequently is people want appearance capture to be practical. So you've seen this massive contraption with the many light sources and cameras and so on. I would say that's not practical. Ideally, you would like to do it with the systems that everyone has at home. Most people have a digital camera at home, and you like to do appearance capture with that. The problem is there's no free lunch. If you'd like to do it with very little data, you have to introduce additional assumptions about the real world. You have to make approximations or introduce priors. So here are two works where we actually did that. So this is a capture setup where we say, okay, all we need is a material sample, and here that's where the assumptions and limitations start. We assume that the material is flat, planar geometry. The next thing that we do is we say we use an LCD panel as a programmable light source. Everyone's got an LCD panel lying around. I've seen a couple of them, which is looking to the audience, and you can use them as a light source. Why not? You can shine light from an LCD panel onto an object. And we use a digital SLR for capture. So this is what the camera would see if we've got an LCD panel shining light onto a sample. So this is a high precision calibration target that we've. Well, it's something that we just made up in order to have a nice spread of different material appearances. And now we display different patterns on this. Oops, sorry. We display different patterns on the screen, and you can see the reflectances coming off the material samples. And from that, we can actually extract a comparatively rich representation. We have designed the whole capture setup together with a representation. And what we determine is, for instance, the diffuse reflectance, the diffuse albedo, surface normals. We can even though we assume that globally or macroscopically it's flat, we allow for microscopic surface variations that are expressed in variations to the surface normal. We have the color of specular highlights. You see some magic marker here, and you see this very typical effect. If you have a highlight on a magic marker, it often looks a little bit purple, even though it's black elsewhere. The level of gloss, the last two parameters determine the shape of the highlights. So all of that you get out of these couple of images taken away. And from that you can now re-render the materials quite realistically. The nice thing about our approach is it was actually one of the first ones that can actually capture mirror reflections accurately. Because in most other setups, you might sometimes, if you have if you're trying to scan a mirror, you get one mirror reflection of your light source, and there's lots of other surface points where you're not seeing anything. But by using this large area light source, we can even deal with specular reflectances. Right? It is nice. You see the scuffs and use marks and so on here. But somehow we thought that's not easy enough, that's not practical enough. So the next step was what can you do with a mobile phone? And in fact, well, in order for it to do it, you have to introduce even more assumptions about the material that you're scanning. So in this particular case, what we assume is that the material is stationary. Stationary means that, for instance, if you wanted to scan this piece of leather, it means that an area here has similar appearance characteristics like the area over there. It doesn't mean that should be the same identical image that you would have here and there, but it should have the same statistical properties in a sense. Now, with that assumption, you can actually extract material appearance out of two images. So we take two pictures with a handheld iPhone. So this is not a mock-up, this is an actual capture session here. And there's no problem that if there is actually ambient lighting. We take two pictures, one with a flash, one without. And what we extract is, again, a diffuse albedo map, a specular albedo map, and some other parameters. We can use them to relight this kind of piece of leather, even though we only observed it under a single lighting condition. We only observed it with a flash direction. We can nevertheless virtually change the lighting directions after that, and render other materials. So all 9 materials that you see here were reconstructed using that method. Each of these 3D data sets that you see here rotating and spinning have been acquired with 2 images each. But what you can see what these things have in common, they're all based on natural textures that have a certain self-similarity spatially. And that is the core assumption. As so often in engineering, you have to find trade-offs, make assumptions in search of a sweet spot in terms of usefulness. Right, another take on how to design systems to acquire appearance parameters and so on is, given if you're trying to, you're basically faced with problems where capturing everything is not possible. And I found actually a lot of these problems in the cultural heritage domain. So there, people have, it's generally common knowledge that scanning is being used in cultural heritage preservation, and it's somehow useful, and people think, yes, somebody should do it, somebody should scan and image all these cultural precious artifacts, and they're so important, so it's very important to do that, right? And then, well, actually many people are doing it, but it's actually unbelievable the discrepancy between what people can do within a certain amount of time and how many objects and artifacts are there that somebody might want to image. And yeah, there's a fair bit of digitization capturing being done when it gets around monitoring, documentation, analyzing, for instance, the state of conservation of things. Digitization is good for archival. But the one thing that often comes to people's minds is the whole concept of the digital surrogate. The idea behind it is that if you create a very good reproduction of an object, you can actually use it in many places instead of the real object. So, for instance, instead of having lots of researchers coming to this one museum that has this artifact, you can shift the digital data set all over the world and everyone can study it from the comfort of their desk. Or, for instance, if the artifact is destroyed, you still have this digital surrogate, which is great, right? And I'm not really arguing against it. What I'm saying is it's extremely difficult to foresee what are basically the quality requirements. What is the precision and accuracy that a scholar 10 years from now would actually have? And what aspects should I acquire? Geometry, color, should it be color calibrated? Should things like reflectance, surface reflectance and so on, should that be a part of it? So there's a lot of uncertainty about future use cases, and as soon as you try to proactively acquire things that might be useful, you end up with an extremely laborious process. That is possible for some objects that are extremely valuable, but for the bulk of cultural heritage artifacts, that's not an option. Hence, many of my projects in that domain were really guided by finding out exactly what is it that some people in the humanities domain would like to do with the data afterwards. So not for the off chance it might be useful scanning something, but really going into domains where people say there's a problem we need to have solved around this artifact, and then really come up with a digitization and capture process that really targets only that problem. And that has implications on what data you actually acquire, at what quality, depending on who acquires it. Usability is a question, depending on how many artifacts, scalability is an aspect. And that informs your system design. So the first example where we applied this pretty much exactly the way I just described is around the wall paintings of Santorini. And on modern-day Santorini, the ancient island Thera, which essentially is a volcano. The whole island is a volcano. And it erupted about 3,700 years ago. Back then, late Bronze Age, there was a civilization living on that island, and their premises were completely covered in ashes through that volcanic eruption, and there's been an excavation in the late 60s unearthing that settlement again. Unfortunately, alongside that volcanic eruption, there was an earthquake, and that earthquake did a lot of destruction to that village that has been excavated. One of the most beautiful finds in that city were the wall paintings of that civilization. Many of the interior walls were covered in wall paintings, many of them actually true frescoes, and they're extremely well preserved in their colors, but they come in many little fragments. So that's an area where we came up with a system to actually scan thousands and tens of thousands of fragments and then apply reassembly algorithms to them. And the problem here is, while 3D scanning in principle is a solved problem, it doesn't scale to tens of thousands of fragments. Everyone who's ever done a 3D scan manually knows that it's a very, very lengthy and manual, painful, interactive approach. You can't do this for lots and lots of different pieces. So in discussing with conservators, we learned more about what are the things that they're actually looking after when deciding whether two fragments should go together. And from these discussions, we distilled a certain accuracy requirement for the geometry, so plus minus an eighth of a millimeter is sufficient. We figured color is interesting, color is nice, but you only really need it on the front surface where there's iconography. The color at the edges on the back, they're not very useful when it gets to matching. And geometry, even though we say a fairly rough geometry is sufficient, there are many cases in which you'd like to have extremely high geometric resolution on the front surface again. Now, once you express your requirements so strictly, you can also come up with a with a very targeted acquisition. So we basically said combined a cheap laser scanner that creates decent geometry but not good color, and a special device that's built for high quality color reproductions for flat surfaces. You can buy them in shops. It was marvelous. The people in the Fresco lab, they were completely excited. They just hadn't thought of it. And the other thing is, well, maybe one of the reasons why I haven't thought about it is because if everyone who's scanned, let's say photographs with a 2D scanner knows it's a real pain. You have these interfaces where you have to draw, bounding boxes. You have to run a very slow preview scan, and then you have to wait until it comes on the screen. You have to select what you'd like to scan, then you scan it again very slowly. Then you open the save dialog and you save as, and so on. Again, not something you want to do with tens of thousands of fragments. So we combined these, off-the-shelf hardware with custom software that, for instance, in the case of the flatbed scanner, does the whole preview scanning, finding the fragment, scanning it at high resolution, storing it where it should go automatically. Not high-flying science, but it makes a massive difference whether you can solve the problem or not. We also came up with a way how to reconstruct fine-scale surface models, by the way, but that's a little beyond the scope here. So using that system, we managed to find automatically a lot of matches, and I can't really go into the details here. All I'd like to say is we reached about the point that we are as successful as the conservators in identifying matches, and we're still lacking the final experiment, the final proof in the field, but based on 4 different frescoes that we scanned, based on lots of simulations that we ran, we're very confident that we're able to speed up the reconstruction process significantly. Another case where we really target the acquisition for a very specific problem was here with the Petrie Museum next door. So the Petrie Museum has a very well-known papyrus collection called the Lachun papyri. Actually, it's only one half of the collection. And the interesting thing about the Lachun collection is it's got papyri that describe all kinds of different content. So you've got everything from a love letter to a shopping list to a description of a medical treatment, to political exchanges, to religious texts. And there's been papyrologists analyzing, for instance, the writings of different scribes, trying to figure out how many people in that village were able to write, and so on. Very interesting stuff. But when I talked to the person working on this, I just came up with a random question. I was saying, was there also different kinds of papyrus? Let's say, the fine, high-quality stuff for the very important things, and the cheap stuff for the shopping list. And he said, well, actually, nobody asked that question yet. So we figured we should find out. So we basically asked ourselves the question: what do we have to acquire, not in order to create a record for coming generations of these papyri, but what is it that we have to acquire in order to answer the question: are there different types of papyrus? So we used again a flatbed scanner-based technique to derive normal maps of the papyrus fibers, but also transmittance maps. And that way we were able to compute statistics of fiber distributions. And the preliminary result is that we actually can say with certainty there is 4 clusters of different papyrus appearances. But it may be premature to say, okay, those used to be 4 different types of papyrus back then. It might as well be that there's been just 4 different methods of conservation that took place. We're still investigating. So one must not jump to conclusions here, but it's another, these papyri can come again in fragments, and they've got about 70,000 fragments, and it's again one of these things. It wouldn't have been possible if you would have started by saying, okay, let's first create the digital surrogate. Okay, I'll just skip them in the interest of time. So the last cultural heritage project I'd like to briefly touch at is around the Great Parchment Book, which is a parchment book here at the London Metropolitan Archive. It is, by many measures, the most important document in Northern Irish history, because it reflects property relations in Northern Ireland at a point in time just before the English crown invaded and changed all of that. So it's not without political potential. And it was basically a book of lots and lots of sheets of parchment. The book fell victim to a fire, I think quite a while ago, in the 18th century, and since then it was basically closed to the public. People were not allowed to study it because it's too delicate. The thing is, what happens if parchment gets hot? It doesn't easily burn like paper would. But like, for instance, hair that gets too close to a candle, it denaturates and hence starts shrinking, shriveling. And that leads to very irregular deformations and makes the whole material also more brittle. So it's too brittle to be handled by the public, and that's why it was actually literally stored like that. So this is actually a photograph from of the real thing. So we were basically called in to say, maybe there's something can be done with digitizing and then having the computer solve the problem. It's always, the first thought that people then have. Let's take modern technology. It often starts with imaging and scanning, and then the computer is smart and does something. But to me, this project is actually a very nice example of how, by looking at the application domain, you learn what not to scan. I entered the project and I really said, okay, there's so many things about parchment that I find interesting. I find the sheen on the parchment really interesting. There's these fiber distributions. They are, anisotropic and so on. And we can find out all about that. But from the beginning, London Metropolitan Archives were very clear about the fact that all they wanted to do is read those parchments. They want to transcribe the content. It's not, the most beautifully written, or it's not a piece of art. There were no, nice pictures in there. It's just about the text, the information in there. So that's really the key requirement. Everything else is optional. And even, moving to a flattened version, you might say, I'd like to undo the wrinkles. Even that is optional. As long as you can read the text, it's fine. So I was very disappointed that basically means I was not allowed to do something that is, color calibrated or surface reflectance related and so on. We thought about virtual reality experiments and so on, spectral ink analysis. We learned that the ink back then was pretty much standardized. Everyone was using the same ink. They know what ink that is, and there's nothing special about it. Right? We thought about multispectral imaging to discover palimpsests and so on. And they said, look, that's Northern Ireland. They had no shortage in sheep, so there was enough parchment. Parchment is animal hide, right? So there was absolutely no reason to go through the pain of creating palimpsests by scraping off one writing and putting another one on top. So it was quite healthy to learn, all the things that didn't make sense to do, and that really in turn allowed us to come up with, let's say, the simplest possible way of acquiring the geometry. So this is a student Kazim who's been working on that, and this is him scanning the parchment. It takes about 60 images with a digital SLR for each side. As you can see, he wasn't allowed to handle it himself. One of the conservators had to come in and turn things over for him. But with that stack of images, it's already possible to 3D reconstruct the parchments, and yes, we did eventually flatten them. So here you see a couple of the reconstructions that we did. There's a lot more to the project, but I won't have time to go into it here. Right. So the last thing that I wanted to touch at is, I talked a lot about digitizing, taking the reality and creating a digital reproduction of it. But you can also go the other direction. So in a sense, if you think of it in terms of the content creation pipeline, you replace visualization by fabricating real-world physical objects. And many of you are probably familiar with the notion of 3D printing, graphic prototyping. And yeah, you can take a real-world object, 3D scan it, and maybe manipulate it digitally, and then 3D print it again. And you basically full circle went from the real world to the digital realm and back. Now I'm very interested in reflectance, so the question was really, can you take reflectance properties, digitize them, and then create objects that have custom reflectance properties? Right, so here's the first attempt to that, and I would say it was the world's first attempt to try that at all, which is always easy, because that's the low-hanging fruit. Yeah? If you and graphics are actually full of that. If people coming up with a problem that nobody had thought of before, and then coming up with a nice, smart solution, and that's how you get well, there's some SIGGRAPH papers that are like that. Because sometimes it's not that easy to come up with a problem that nobody saw before. But if you can, there's a high reward. So what we basically said, okay, what if we wanted to say, I'd like to have an arbitrary, custom highlight on the surface. So here, let's say, this is how we specify how a highlight on the surface should look like. It's actually inverse. So the darker something is, the more reflectance I have here. And in fact, this is actually a measured highlight from brushed aluminium on a hemispherical plot. Now, reproducing brushed aluminium is maybe a bit boring, because the easiest way to do it is to brush aluminium. So let's come up with something more interesting. Let's say we'd like to have a highlight that looks like that. What we do is we basically sample this hemispherical distribution and say, let's say on a microscopic level, we'd like to have lots of little mirrors, where basically the entirety of these mirrors creates the spatial distribution of reflectance that we would like to have, the directional distribution. The problem, though, is you wouldn't be able to fabricate this. You wouldn't be able to manufacture a surface that looks like that. There's lots of discontinuities here. All the red pieces here are discontinuities, and they will doubtlessly also interact with the light. So they are going to disturb you. It's a nice mathematical model, nice mathematical idea to have these mirror distributions, but there's a lot of other stuff happening here that's going to completely destroy what you're looking at. However, what you can do is you can just take these facets, don't change them at all, but just have them trade places and shuffle them around. And if you do that in the right way, you end up with something that is near continuous. It's tileable. You can mass produce it. And then actually, we didn't mass produce it. We have exactly one entity that we milled out of aluminium, and it's fairly large. So in order to demonstrate how a highlight looks like, and I'm again victim of the low contrast on the projector, what we do is we shine light from a video projector. We just use a video projector as a light source, essentially. We shine light onto the sample, which is mounted on the back of this sample holder, and then we reflect the light is reflected against the wall. If you look very closely, you can see the kind of spiral that we just specified. Now here's some better examples with more contrast and more visible. So here's the input highlight specification, the shape that we produced. We actually manufactured that. So this is a real photograph, right? Darkened room, we reflect light off the surface. That geometry casts this kind of reflectance. Here's another highlight specification, the corresponding geometry, and you get that. Right? Now you can do something similar also with refraction. And here in this example, as a different project, we even said, okay, we don't want to have little planar mirrors. We would like to have little lenslets that create Gaussian distributed blobs of light. And as you can see, we can recreate images and photographs that way. We later learned that the general field of research is called non-imaging optics. But we were relieved that even for their standards, it was a contribution. Here's another example. Okay, good. So to conclude, appearance is an extremely rich field to work on. And I personally like it because it really sits at that interface between the physicality of the real world and digital modeling. And The problem, though, is that the aspects of appearance, whether you want to capture it, to represent it, to fabricate it, is so rich that you always end up with some engineering prototype. So yes, I admit it, I'm an engineer, and I like being an engineer, I like this kind of work. But in order to find meaningful sweet spots in this design space, it really helps to look at application domains and be guided by that. So it's really dependent, obviously, on the object you'd like to represent, but also on the application needs that you have. And whatever you do, always put a lot of thought into how you represent your appearance, because that's going to affect everything. So, right, the key is really to jointly capture, to work on capture and representation. So, lastly, I would like to say a lot of things go to all the people that I work with, to all the people that, without them I wouldn't be standing here, and many of the, all of the things that you've seen, without them they wouldn't exist. I took this as an occasion to look up all my co-authors, and I was stunned by the sheer number, and suddenly I felt very small and insignificant. I managed to find photographs of about 2/3 of them. But here are my co-authors, and many thanks to them, and I'm actually glad to see some of you here. Thank you for coming, and that concludes my talk.
I'd like now to call on Professor Anthony Steed to deliver a vote of thanks for the inaugural. With that. With that. It's my great pleasure to give a vote of thanks for Tim, who's been a member of the group since 2008. As John alluded to, we were very pleased to extract Tim from Princeton and bring him here when there were just a couple of those projects, and a gut feeling that there was a promising researcher that we could bag. And as you can see, that's paid off since 2008. Tim's rise and increase in work and the number of projects you've seen, and I think this is probably half of them.
Yeah, 2/3 maybe.
2/3 of the projects. There's a great range, and you've seen that they're visually impressive. The group at the time was small. Now we're much larger, and partly that's thanks to Tim and all of the work that he's brought in, and all of these collaborators, of course, got the relationship with UCL or at UCL. I wanted to pull out two types of thing. From the work, I was quite impressed. I was wondering how many integrals there would be in the talk, and there weren't any. There was a slide that sort of headed that way, but I wanted to point out that Tim's work is very rigorous, and if you read the papers at SIGGRAPH, you don't get in without being rigorous. And behind a lot of that work, it's a bit easy in graphics. You say this image, this one's better than this, but there's a lot of rigor behind that, and that's one of the things that Tim's work is known for. And the analysis alongside of how you choose the system, and not just building a system and then seeing what you can scan, but starting from first principles is, again, distinguish that work. And some of those systems look simple, but design is simple. Making things simple is hard work. And I think we've seen the impact of that in some of the work that's been possible that hasn't been possible before. I also want to highlight the sheer practicality. There's a lot of these things. I'm a mathematician, I became an engineer, and Tim seems to have started with all this passion about building systems, and that's, again, a great compliment to the work here, or compliment to the skills that we have. Building these systems. I've seen some of these prototypes, while they're still around and stored in labs, that the actual building of the system is a key contribution to bring the engineering together. So I just want to highlight those aspects of the work, the work that you've seen. But then I want to highlight three areas I think that why we're here today, and why we're celebrating Tim's professorship,
is that the first reason is that there's very diverse impact of the work, very diverse collaborators, and you've seen some of that in the talk, that there's people from all the way from heritage through to product design, the work on skin colour, for example, with Procter & Gamble and so on. So I run an engineering doctorate centre, and Tim is possibly the biggest user of our funding for collaborations with doctorates with industry and having that direct input. The second area I want to highlight is this whole area of digital heritage being unique and so productive, in that computer graphics is often driven by the film industry and the games industry, with a little bit of an outpost in mechanical engineering and CAD but the heritage applications are important, and I think they're in growing importance to graphics, and Tim's got some, I think will be some seminal papers in that area that have brought that really to the forefront of minds in our field. And the third area I just wanted to highlight, again, is looking towards the future, this idea of fabrication of non-standard outputs. And I think that's, again, incredibly important for computer graphics and from the field. And I think there's some of these applications, some of these papers we'll see, again, will be seminal in the field, because a lot of graphics is now moving towards this idea of fabrication of complex objects and output that's not just streaming to your phone or streaming to your TV. So with those three aspects, the diverse area, the diverse impacts, the sort of the diverse collaborators, the diverse impact areas, and the future vision, or the way in which Tim is pushing computer graphics in new areas, I think is why we're here, and is the substance of my proposal. So thanks again, Tim. I wish you many more years with the group, and I look forward to many more collaborations with the students here, and with a growing network of people around UCL. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.